Joan Crawford was the most controlled woman in Hollywood. Every room in her mansion had a standard. Every photograph was approved. Every public appearance was rehearsed. For 50 years, she built one of the most famous names in the world, carefully, deliberately, without a single crack the cameras could find. But in September 1974, inside a quiet room in New York, Joan Crawford picked up a pen and signed something that would destroy everything she had spent a lifetime constructing. Not her career, not her image. Something she thought she had already buried, the private version of what happened inside that mansion. The things her daughter Christina Crawford had lived through and stayed silent about for 30 years. The document was her will, and buried inside it was a single sentence, 11 words, addressed directly to Christina. For reasons which are well known to them. No explanation, no warning. Christina would find out from a stranger after her mother was dead. What existed before Joan Crawford lifted that pen? The last fragile possibility that Christina would ever be believed. After she set it down, that possibility had a legal document standing against it. She made sure of it. One moment changed everything. The tragic muse finds the moment's history buried. Subscribe so they are never forgotten. To understand what Joan Crawford destroyed when she signed that will, you have to understand what she had spent 50 years building, and why she could not stop building it, even when it started to cost her the thing she claimed to want most. She was not born Joan Crawford. She was born Lucille Fay LeSueur in San Antonio, Texas, in 1904. Her father left before she had words for him. Her mother remarried. The stepfather ran a laundry and Lucille worked in it. Not as a lesson, not occasionally. She worked because the family needed her to, in the way children who grow up without a financial floor learn to contribute before they learn to dream. She did not end school in any consistent way. There was no stable address long enough for that. What she had instead was attention. A sharp, vigilant attention that belonged to children who learn early that the environment can shift without warning, and that the only reliable protection is the ability to read a room before it reads you. She watched performers. She taught herself to dance in back rooms that were not quite respectable and did not care, because respectability was for people who could afford it, and she could not. Not yet. She was good enough that people paid to watch. She moved north. She entered a fan magazine contest in 1925 that MGM ran to rename a new starlet. The name that came back from the contest's readers, Joan Crawford. She was 21 years old. She took the name without visible reluctance and never looked back. Here is what matters about Joan Crawford that most accounts miss. She did not simply perform. She understood, earlier and more completely than almost anyone in her era, that public identity was a construction project. Not pretending. Construction. There is a critical difference, and she knew it. Pretending is a lie you are always one slip away from exposing. Construction is architecture, load-bearing, structural, something you can live inside without the walls moving. She built Joan Crawford the way you build a house. Room by room, material by material, until the house was indistinguishable from the person who inhabited it. The carpets were always clean. The clothes were always pressed. The face was always ready. This discipline was not a personality quirk. It was the lesson she had extracted from a childhood where the absence of control meant the laundry, meant another address, meant a school left before it became familiar. Control was not something Joan Crawford had stumbled into as a Hollywood affectation. It was the only tool she had found that actually worked, that could transform one kind of life into another, and she applied it to everything without exception. Her body, her schedule, her correspondence, the way she walked into a room. There was no such thing as a casual moment for Joan Crawford. There were only moments that looked casual because she had practiced them until they did. By the early 1930s, she was one of the most famous women in America. The fan mail alone required staff to manage. Thousands of letters a month from people who felt they knew her. She answered every piece of it, or appeared to. She knew this was not optional. She understood that celebrity in the studio era was not built on screen time alone. It was built in the space between films, in the maintenance of the image, in the consistent signal that she was exactly who she had always been. The performance did not stop when the cameras did. It ran 24 hours a day, every day across 40 years. She gave them something to believe. And she gave it so consistently, and maintained it so completely, that the construction became indistinguishable from the truth. That was the point. It had always been the point. But alongside the construction of Joan Crawford the star, there was a private decision she made quietly. In the years when the marriages had ended and the clinical record of what she called her losses was something she would never fully discuss in any interview she gave. She wanted a family. She had been married twice. First to Douglas Fairbanks Jr., a union that ended in 1933 after 4 years, by all public accounts cordially. Then to Frank Tone, which ended in 1939. She had also experienced, according to her own statements across multiple interviews given over her career, pregnancies that did not result in living children. She offered no details. The medical record is not publicly available. What is available is the decision that followed. In June 1940, Joan Crawford adopted a baby girl. She named her Christina, and then, immediately, without hesitation, she told the press. This is the first thing to understand about everything that followed. Christina Crawford was not a private adoption, quietly kept from a public that had come to expect access. She was announced, photographed, placed inside the Joan Crawford narrative immediately as evidence, visible, certified evidence, that the life being constructed was real and complete. The fan magazines ran the pictures. Joan Crawford, devoted mother. She was radiant, they reported. She had everything. What that meant for Christina, born into a story already being told about her, whose audience was not her family but millions of strangers with expectations, would not become clear for years. But the shape of it was fixed from the first photograph. Christina had been given a role before she could speak. The role was proof. Proof that Joan Crawford was everything the construction promised. Nothing that followed would ever change what that role required. But what the role required of a real child, living inside a real house with a real mother who had spent 50 years learning that performance was survival, that is where the story actually begins. The house that matters is at 426 North Bristol Avenue in Bel Air. Joan Crawford moved throughout her career as circumstances changed, studio relationships, marriages, finances. But Bristol Avenue is the house Christina Crawford wrote about. It is the house where the two versions of Joan Crawford existed alongside each other, separated by nothing more substantial than the distance between a public room and a private one. Every room in that house had a standard. This is documented not only in Christina Crawford's memoir Mommie Dearest, published in 1978, but in accounts from household staff who spoke over the following years, and in Joan Crawford's own public statements about motherhood, which she gave freely, consistently, and in considerable detail across decades of interviews. She believed in structure. She believed children required discipline. She believed that softness was not kindness, it was a failure to prepare. The closets were organized to a specific system. Clothes had to hang a certain way, facing a certain direction, in a particular order. Cleaning methods for each room were precise and non-negotiable. Meals were not casual. Behavior in public and behavior in private did not follow the same rules, and the children were expected to understand the difference without explanation. Joan Crawford's public statements and Christina Crawford's private testimony agree on this much. Bristol Avenue was not a relaxed household. Where they diverge is on what the discipline became when the visitors had left and the cameras were gone. What Christina Crawford described in Mommie Dearest, a book she spent years building and published at genuine personal cost, was not a portrait of a harsh upbringing by the standards of the era. It was specific, sustained. She described a beating with a wire hanger, administered in the middle of the night, over the condition of her closet. She described being woken at 2 a.m. for inspections that had no purpose beyond the exercise of control. She described food withheld, not as a single incident but as a recurring instrument. She described being sent away, to boarding schools, to relatives, to summer camps, with a frequency and a manner that accumulated, over years, into a single unmistakable message. Her absence was more manageable than her presence. She also described something that is harder to name than any specific incident. She described the parallel. The way the mother who appeared in fan magazine spreads and charity galas and Christmas photographs, always dressed, always composed, always the devoted public mother, and the mother who came into the bedroom at 2 a.m. with a rage that had no ceiling visible from inside it, existed in the same body, in the same house, in the same week, sometimes the same day, without ever once acknowledging each other. Both versions were real, neither canceled, the other out. I have read this period in 4 different accounts: biographies, staff memoirs, and Christina Crawford's own testimony across multiple decades of interviews. Every version describes the same architecture: a household of warmth and visibility on one side of a door, and something else entirely on the other. None of the accounts written from outside the house understood what they were seeing. They had access to the public version. It was convincing. It was designed to be. This is the first ripple, and it matters not for what it was, but for what it produced next. A household whose private reality has no external witness does not produce a child who can be easily believed. Produces the opposite. It produces an adult whose most formative experiences are entirely undocumented, existing only in her own testimony, weighed against a public record built over 50 years by someone with a genius for what gets preserved. The first ripple created the silence. The silence created the conditions for everything that came after. Joan Crawford understood the relationship between documentation and credibility. She had built her career on it. Whether the domestic architecture was conscious strategy or simply the extension of an instinct she had developed over a lifetime, the result was identical either way. After that, everything was already in motion. But what the silence required of Christina, across 3 decades, what it cost to carry an experience that had no witness and no record, that is the second ripple. And it landed harder than the first. Christina Crawford grew up. This deserves more weight than it usually receives. Despite the Bristol Avenue household, despite the midnight inspections and the wire hanger and the years of removal, she became an adult and she tried to build a life. She wanted to act. Pause on that for a moment. The daughter of Joan Crawford, the woman who had made performance into an identity so complete and so self-referential, at it had consumed whatever private self she began with, wanted to act. Whether this was genuine love of the craft, or an unconscious attempt to be seen in the only language her mother had ever fully respected, or simply what she was drawn toward without analysis, Christina Crawford herself has given different answers at different times. All 3 were probably true at once. She trained. She worked. Through the 1960s, she built a real television career, recurring roles, episodic work, the kind of steady professional foundation that takes years and genuine talent to construct. People who worked with her described her as serious and capable. She was not using her mother's name as a shortcut. She was doing the labor. And during those working years, there was also a relationship with Joan Crawford. Irregular, difficult, marked by long silences that broke into warmth and contracted again without warning. But present. The women visited. They appeared in photographs together. They did what people in complicated family relationships often do. They maintained a connection that neither fully trusted and neither fully released. Joan Crawford in the 1960s was no longer at the height of her power. The MGM contract had ended in 1943. The Oscar for Mildred Pierce in 1946 had rescued her career, but the decades since had been uneven. Roles harder to find, public relevance more effortful to maintain. The Pepsi-Cola board seat, inherited through her 4th marriage to Alfred Steele and retained after his death in 1959, gave her continued public presence and something that functioned as professional purpose. But the industry had moved on from her in the particular way it moves on from women of a certain age with a certain kind of fame. Not dramatically, not with announcement, but incrementally until one day the calls simply come less often. In this context, an aging star with diminishing professional footing and a daughter trying to build her own career, the relationship between. And Joan and Christina continued. Effortful, watchful, neither fully honest. Christina Crawford, in interviews given long after the memoir's publication, described these years as years of hoping. She had never stopped hoping. That is the phrase she kept returning to. Not hoping for repair, not hoping for the past to be addressed, but hoping for something real, some moment of recognition between them that was not performance, that was not for an audience. She was also, during this period, in therapy, building language for an experience that had very little available to it yet. The clinical vocabulary for understanding what sustained, controlled childhood abuse looks like. Its patterns, its effects, the way it operates through unpredictability rather than single incidents was not yet common. She was doing the translation work herself without a map. What staying quiet cost her is not dramatic. It is quiet. The cost was continuous internal management, holding two truths at the same time for 30 years. That the woman who hurt her was also the woman she was still reaching toward. That speaking would not be believed. Not yet, not without a witness, and the house had never had one. She was not wrong about the calculation. She was precisely right. The silence was a choice made from accurate information about an impossible position. And the impossible position had been built, piece by piece, over decades by the same hands that had built everything else. The moment passed. The silence remained. But beneath the silence was a third structure, and it was already being assembled in the years before 1974, in ways that made the will not just possible but inevitable. By September 1974, 3 structures had been built around Christina Crawford's story, each one constructed from what came before it, each one making the possibility of being believed slightly more remote. The first was the household, a private reality with no external documentation, maintained by a woman who you understood better than anyone in her industry what documentation was worth. The rooms on Bristol Avenue had been kept to a standard and presented to every visitor according to a standard. The private version, the 2 a.m. version, the wire hanger, the food and the silence and the removals, existed in the space between public appearances and was never once recorded, named, or acknowledged in any medium Joan Crawford controlled. That was not carelessness. This was a woman who answered thousands of fan letters and managed her own publicity and understood that public identity was architecture. She did not leave the private version undocumented by accident. The second structure was the silence that the first one produced. Christina Crawford stayed quiet through the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, and into the early 1970s. Not because she lacked the intelligence or the language to speak. She stayed quiet because she had accurately assessed the outcome of speaking. Joan Crawford's public record was immense. 40 years of documented, photographed, published, awarded devotion to her craft and her audience and her visible role as a mother. Christina had her own testimony. No corroborating documents. No witnesses who had been inside the private version and would go on record. She was not wrong. She was exactly right about exactly that. The silence was a precise response to an impossible position. An impossible position that had been constructed, detail by detail, across decades, by the same woman who had constructed everything else in her life. The third structure arrived in 1973, the year before the will. Pepsi-Cola's new management declined to renew Joan Crawford's board involvement. She had held that seat for 14 years. She had attended meetings, traveled for events, represented the brand with the same relentless, professional consistency she brought to everything. The removal was handled with the institutional coldness that corporations use when they have decided something. A letter, not a conversation. An ending without ceremony. She was, afterward, alone in a way she had not been since before she became Joan Crawford. The Manhattan apartment, a reduced staff, the social architecture of her peak years, the dinners, the screenings, the public engagements that had kept her surrounded by activity and purpose, had contracted to something quiet, controlled, and increasingly self-contained. The friends of her most powerful years were aging. The industry calls came rarely. The construction that had taken 50 years to build was still standing, but the audience for it had thinned. Into that quiet, in September 1974, she called her attorney. The first structure made the second one possible. The second made the third possible. The third produced the will. Each step traceable. Each step deliberate. Each step the product of the same logic that had organized everything before it. The moment was not fate. It was the conclusion of an argument that only one person had been allowed to make. But what it would have taken to reverse what that signed page did, what reversal actually required, that is the most precise measure of how carefully the moment had been engineered. To undo what Joan Crawford's will had done, not legally, but in the record, in the place where Christina's experience actually lived, several things would have needed to be true simultaneously. None of them were. The first requirement, Joan Crawford would have had to be alive. She died on May 10, 1977, in her New York apartment. The cause of death listed on the certificate was acute myocardial infarction. Her housekeeper found her. In her final weeks, according to people who visited, she had requested there be no public display of mourning on her behalf. One of her final statements, reported by those present, was a rebuke of someone praying at her bedside. "Don't you dare ask God to help me." She died with the will in place. She died before Christina had any opportunity to respond to it. She died before anyone outside the attorney's office knew what it contained. The first requirement was gone before Christina knew she needed it. The second requirement. The will's language would have had to be ambiguous. It was not. For reasons which are well known to them. 11 words. They do not say she had no love for Christina. They do not suggest estrangement or complication or any of the soft language families use when relationships have simply grown difficult. They say the reasons exist, are settled, and are known. They imply judgment. They imply that something Christina did, something established, something that could be pointed to, justified the exclusion. The sentence answers the question before anyone outside the room can ask it. And because it frames the exclusion as Christina's earned outcome rather than Joan Crawford's choice, it converts an act of power into an act of record-keeping. The sentence was written for an audience, not for Christina, for anyone who would read the will after Joan Crawford was gone and wonder. It was, in the most precise sense, a final public statement, delivered through a legal document witnessed and filed permanent. The third requirement. Christina Crawford would have had to be believed. She was not. Not immediately. Not by the people whose belief would have mattered most in 1978, when Mommie Dearest was published by William Morrow and reached the New York Times bestseller list within weeks. The response from Hollywood was organized and defensive. Joan Crawford's surviving colleagues, friends, and professional associates pushed back publicly and forcefully. The argument that emerged, that Christina was a troubled daughter speaking against a dead woman who could no longer respond, motivated by grievance or money or both, was effective precisely because it inverted the actual power dynamic. Joan Crawford had controlled the record for 50 years. Every public statement, every photograph, every app. Arance had been on her terms. Christina Crawford was attempting, for the first time, to place a different version on record. The industry treated the established version as self-evidently more credible, and treated the challenger as self-evidently suspect. The household staff who corroborated aspects of Christina's account, some on record, many in background conversations that biographers and journalists documented over the following decades, were not sufficient to overcome the weight of the public persona. A persona that was 4 decades deep, that had fan letters and award ceremonies and a Pepsi-Cola board seat and a public history that had been maintained so successfully it had become, for most people, simply the truth. Christina Crawford had a book, her own voice, and 30 years of silence that could be read, by those who chose to read it that way, as evidence that nothing had ever happened. Each requirement was impossible. Each impossibility was built from the previous one. Each one traceable to the same set of decisions made across 50 years by the same hand. The requirement was simple. She had made sure it could never be met. From this distance, the moment looks smaller than it did in 1974. And that is the most frightening thing about it. Go back to September 30th, 1974. A woman at a desk. Pen. Witnesses in the room. Less than an hour. Now look at what was inside that moment. All of it. The house on Bristol Avenue is inside it. The closets inspected at midnight. The meals removed without explanation. The boarding schools and the removals and the 2 a.m. footsteps down a carpeted hallway. All of it compressed into legal language. Translated into the passive authority of a will. For reasons which are well known to them. 30 years of a private version, converted into 11 words that redirected accountability back toward Christina as the source of her own erasure. The 40 years of fan mail are inside it. Every letter answered, every public appeal. Rants staged and maintained and photographed. All of that is inside the moment because all of that is what made the sentence work. Without the public record of devoted motherhood behind it, the will's language would have been readable as bitterness, as the final move of a difficult woman. With the public record behind it, the sentence was a verdict delivered by someone the world had reason to trust. The silence is inside it. Christina's 3 decades of calculating that speaking would not hold, that her word against the official record would not be enough. That silence is inside the moment, because the silence was what the moment required to be possible. A counter-narrative, existing in any form, would have changed the weight of the sentence. The silence was the condition the moment needed, and the silence had been built originally by the house. The Pepsi board removal is inside it. The contracted social world. The New York apartment and the reduced staff and the particular quality of a decision made by someone who is aging alone, with no one positioned to say, wait, think about this again. Is this what you mean to do? And the witnesses are inside it. The 2 people who stood in that room and signed their names and saw nothing except a composed, elderly woman completing routine paperwork. They walked out and went home and told no one, because there was nothing to tell. It was administrative, routine. Over by mid-afternoon, they were the last audience for the public version of Joan Crawford, present one final time, certifying it. The moment I returned to, in every account I read, in 4 different biographies, in Christina Crawford's own testimony across decades of interviews, in the contemporary reporting around Joan Crawford's death, was not the signing itself. It was the sentence. For reasons which are well known to them, the reasons were not well known. Not to Christina, who has said in every interview given on the subject that she was never told what reasons were. Not to anyone except Joan Crawford, who was gone before the question could be put to her directly. But the sentence did not need to be accurate. It only needed to be filed. Once it was in a legal document, witnessed and recorded, it became the official version of a relationship that had never had an official version before. It became the permanent answer to a question no one had yet publicly asked. Joan Crawford had spent 50 years making sure the official version was the one she controlled. The will was simply the last time she did it. 1 year out, 1975, Christina Crawford did not know the will existed. She was recovering from a serious automobile accident in 1974 that had left her with significant injuries requiring extended rehabilitation. She was working through the physical recovery and managing her career alongside the ongoing, quiet effort of whatever the relationship with her mother still was. Irregular contact, long silences, the kind of maintenance that takes energy without giving much back. The document was sitting in a file at a law office in Los Angeles. It was waiting. From 1 year out, the moment was invisible. The surface of Christina's life gave no indication that something irreversible had already happened. There was nothing to indicate it had. 5 years out, 1979, Mommie Dearest had been in print for 12 months. Christina Crawford was living inside the full force of the response. The disbelief, the industry's defensive formation around one of its most celebrated names. The op-eds framing the book as betrayal, as a daughter using the protection of her mother's death to say things that could not be answered. The professional consequences. Roles that had been available to her before publication were no longer available after it. She was also hearing, for the first time, from people she had never met, women and men across the country who had grown up in households that looked like Bristol Avenue from the outside, and who had never had words for what they experienced inside, until they read hers. These letters came in the thousands. They came from people who were not asking for anything. They were simply saying, I recognize something. From 5 years out, the moment was fully visible. The will, and specifically that sentence, had not created Christina Crawford's story. The story had existed for 30 years in a version the world was never permitted to see. What the will had done was make it impossible for the story to stay private. It had put the private relationship into the public record. It had issued a verdict. And a verdict, once issued, invites appeal. Joan Crawford had designed the will to close the case. Instead, it reopened it, under circumstances she had not anticipated, in language she could no longer control. From here, nearly 50 years after that afternoon in September 1974. Nearly a century since a girl named Lucille worked a laundry in San Antonio and decided, with the precision of someone who had never had the luxury of being vague, that she would become someone the world could not ignore. From here, the moment reveals something specific about the relationship between power and permanence. Joan Crawford built her entire life on one principle: the public record outlasts private experience. What is documented outlasts what is only remembered. What is photographed outlasts what is only felt. What is filed and witnessed and preserved outlasts what is simply true. What she could not account for, what no amount of architectural precision could prevent, was that her daughter had learned the same principle. Christina Crawford did not give a press conference. She did not mount a public campaign. She sat down and wrote 380 pages. Specific, sustained, documented in the way that only lived experience can be documented, with the texture of real memory, the unevenness of real time, the details that no one invents because no one would think to. She put the private version into language that could be read, retained, returned to, and translated into dozens of editions across half a century, in languages Joan Crawford would never have imagined. Mommie Dearest has never gone out of print. The will was designed to be the last word on Christina Crawford's claim to her mother's legacy. It was not. Joan Crawford died on May 10, 1977. The announcement moved quickly through the industry she had inhabited for 50 years. Tributes arrived from colleagues, studio executives, the fan networks she had maintained through decades of personal correspondence. The language of the tributes was consistent. Extraordinary discipline, extraordinary devotion, a career that had defined an era. The memorial service in New York drew hundreds of people. The eulogies described the public version, because the public version was all most of them had ever had access to. Christina Crawford was not there. She did not issue a public statement. The estate was valued at approximately $2 million, though this figure has varied across different reports. It went to charitable organizations and to Joan Crawford's two youngest adopted daughters, Kathy and Cindy, who have spoken publicly throughout their lives about an experience of childhood categorically different from Christina's and Christopher's. Warmer, safer, more stable. They have maintained, consistently and without significant qualification, that their mother was loving toward them. These accounts are not contradictory to Christina's in the way they are often presented as being. A person can treat different children differently. A parent can be both the mother Kathy and Cindy describe and the mother Christina describes, not because one account is false, but because people are not single consistent selves across all relationships, and families are not a single shared experience. The children of difficult parents often report entirely different versions of the same household. This is no paradox. It is how households work. Christina Crawford began writing shortly after her mother's death. She has said she had been carrying the material for years, not organized, not shaped yet into narrative, but present, real. The will, when she finally learned of it, was not a surprise in the way surprises usually work. It was the confirmation of something she had known in other terms for a long time, that the official version of the relationship was the one Joan Crawford had filed, not the one Christina had lived. The will gave her a reason to stop waiting for private acknowledgement. Mommie Dearest was published on September 10, 1978. Within weeks it was on the New York Times bestseller list. Within a month the debate it had ignited, whether a daughter has the right to speak the truth about a mother who cannot respond, whether the scale of a public life affords its subject a kind of immunity to private testimony, was being conducted in newspapers, magazines, living rooms, and therapy offices across the country. The 1981 film adaptation, starring Faye Dunaway, reached an entirely different and wider audience, and introduced the story's most specific images: the wire hanger, the nighttime confrontation, the controlled fury of a woman who had made discipline into a form of love she could not untangle from a form of harm, to people who had not read the book. The film's cultural life is complicated. It has been treated as camp. It has also been treated as something harder by people who recognized what it was describing. The book came first. The book is the record. Joan Crawford's former colleagues and professional circle disputed the account publicly and organized against it. Some wrote their own versions of Joan Crawford. The pushback from inside Hollywood was, for many years, the dominant public response. A dead woman could not defend herself. A grieving daughter could not be trusted. A public record that long and that consistent should not be overturned. Why a single book? The household staff disagreed. Not publicly and not immediately, but over the following years, in conversations documented by multiple biographers and journalists, people who had worked inside the Bristol Avenue household described an environment consistent with significant portions of what Christina had written. Not identical. Not a complete corroboration. but consistent with the architecture she had described. A household of extreme discipline, unpredictable standards, and a private environment that did not resemble the public one. The full private truth of Bristol Avenue is not recoverable. It lives in the experience of people who were inside it, some of whom are still alive. What can be recovered is the record, what was written, what was corroborated, what was disputed, and what has persisted. Christina Crawford's version persisted. The moment passed. Nothing else did. Christina Crawford is still alive as this is written. She is in her 80s. She has spent the decades since Mommie Dearest speaking at events focused on child welfare and abuse prevention. She has not softened her account. She has given interviews in which she describes the same events she described in 1978, in the same terms with the same specificity. The conversation around her mother has changed. Not reversed, changed. The frameworks available now for understanding what Christina described are more developed than anything that existed in 1978. The clinical understanding of sustained childhood abuse, how it operates through control and unpredictability rather than through single dramatic incidents that leave obvious evidence, how it coexists with genuine love and genuine harm in the same person, how it produces adult survivors who carry testimony that is vivid and precise and immediately met with skepticism because the experience was specifically designed to produce no external record. All of that is part of common understanding now. In ways it simply was not when the Bel Air was published. Some of what made Christina Crawford difficult to believe in 1978 was the absence of a map. People could not locate what she described inside any story they had been given about how serious harm works, because the available stories required the wrong elements. Harm happened in recognizably bad places, to people without resources, in ways that left visible marks. Bristol Avenue was a mansion. Joan Crawford was an icon. The marks were interior. The map exists now. It was built, in part, from testimony like Christina Crawford's. What the moment on that Tuesday in September 1974 destroyed was specific. Not Christina Crawford's career. She survived that. Not her public voice, that came back, louder than the will had been designed to permit. Not even her financial claim to the estate, which was modest and had never been her primary concern. What it destroyed was the possibility of the other kind of acknowledgement. The private kind. The kind that has no audience, no record, no legal consequence. The kind that happens between two people in a room without ceremony, where one person looks at another and says, "I know what happened. I know what I did. You are not wrong about what it was." Joan Crawford died without that happening. She had arranged, with the same precision she had applied to every other element of her public and private life, for it not to happen, not while she was alive and not after she was gone. The will was the instrument. The sentence was the mechanism. 11 words that converted the question into a settled matter before the question could be publicly asked. Every element of it was the same logic she had used to build everything else. Control the record. Control what is preserved. Control what comes after. But a daughter had also spent 50 years watching how that logic worked. Christina Crawford sat down and wrote 380 pages in language clear enough to be translated, specific enough to be returned to honest Inu. To be recognized by people who had never met her and had no reason to take her side. She put the private version on record. She made it permanent. Joan Crawford had spent 50 years understanding that permanence is power. She had taught that, without intending to the daughter she tried to erase. And on a quiet afternoon in September 1974, when she set down her pen and the witnesses filed out and the attorney gathered the pages and the door closed on the room, she had already given Christina Crawford the one thing that would make silence impossible. A legal document that said, "The reasons are well known." They were not well known. They had never been spoken aloud, in any room where both of them were present, in any language that acknowledged what had actually happened. Christina Crawford spent the rest of her life making sure they were. From this distance, one afternoon in Los Angeles, a signature, less than an hour, a sentence 11 words long, the moment looks small, almost unremarkable, the kind of thing you could forget by dinner. That is what a trap looks like when it closes. Not dramatic, not announced, not built to be visible from the outside, just done.